The American Revolution has been fought and it was a victory for the colonies. And now they have to figure out how to translate that victory on the battlefield into a victory that will be a long lasting victory of this country actually being formed and surviving. Now the hard work is going to start because they're going to have to figure out how they're going to make a go of this. It was somewhat easy or easier when the war was going on because you had a common foe. You had England. Now they're not that foe has been taken away, so they're going to have to figure out how to get along and how to make this thing work. They have been operating under a form of government that was created under the Articles of Confederation. This was the Confederation government. The biggest achievement of the Confederation government was its land policy. And under the Ordinance of 1787, the area north of the Ohio River was to be divided into anywhere from 3 to 5 territories. Each would go through 3 stages of government. In the first, it would be ruled by a governor appointed by Congress. In the second, when the male population was 5,000, an elected legislature was added and a delegate sent to Congress. And in the third, after the population was 60,000, the territory would enter the Union as a state. And there would also be a Bill of Rights. This guaranteed that any new states coming in would come in as the equal of the original 13. This was very smart on their part. Had they could have done it the other way. They could have said that the 13 original ones would always be dominant and that any state coming in after would be less than them. And had they done that, there probably would have been a civil war a lot sooner than the one we had, and it would have been probably east to west, because any new territory coming in as a state would not have wanted to come in as a secondary state to those original 13, and they were intelligent enough to realize that. But you began to have the states not cooperating with one another. One state might create its own system of money. They were taxing each other, and the Confederation government really couldn't make them do anything. The government could ask for taxes, they could ask for militia, but it was up to a state whether or not they wanted to cooperate with that, and often they didn't. And really, men that had property began to be very concerned that the country was going to fall apart. And so there were some that worked together to basically have a convention called. The idea was that they were going to kind of review and try to improve the Articles of Confederation. They're going to end up meeting in Philadelphia, and they're going to end up completely doing away with the Articles and writing a whole new document, and this will become the Constitution. So you have the Constitutional Convention meeting in Philadelphia in May of 1787. A couple of things that come out of that. You have the Great Compromise, which is when they set up the system of government that we have today with a House of Representatives and a Senate. They also agree to a thing that they referred to as a 3/5 compromise. This was over slavery. They agreed to count 3/5 of a slave in apportioning both representation and taxes. Slavery is going to become more and more of an issue as we move on. And it's not going to go away. They kept thinking, these early founding fathers, that someone smarter than them would come along and be able to come up with a solution over the problem of slavery. That's not going to happen, but they kept hoping that it would. James Madison, who keeps most of the notes during this Constitutional Convention, is going to be referred to as the father of the Constitution. And so then they had to submit this Constitution to the states for the states to ratify before it to go into effect. Now, almost immediately, you had a group of people who were known as the Federalists who supported it, and another group of people who were against it called the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists felt that it gave too much power to a central government, and so they were very concerned about it. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison produced the Federalist Papers, a book of 85 essays that argued for ratification. New Hampshire in June of 1788 was the ninth state to ratify putting the government into effect. In Virginia, ratification was secured in June 1788 only when the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights. New York ratified when Virginia did. North Carolina waited until a Bill of Rights was actually added, and Rhode Island refused to ratify until threatened with economic boycott. The first presidential election, George Washington is going to be chosen as president, and you see him here in this painting at the Constitutional Convention. John Adams becomes his vice president. You have executive departments being created. Under the Department of State, Washington names Thomas Jefferson. The Secretary of War will be Henry Knox. Secretary of Treasury will be Alexander Hamilton. Edmund Randolph became Attorney General. And after Congress decided that the Supreme Court should be made up of a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, Washington named John Jay as the first Chief Justice. And the first order of business for Congress was to actually create that bill, pass that Bill of Rights. They had promised to do that. And so the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are considered to be the Bill of Rights. And of course, as it is in anything, if you're setting up a household or a new government, money and economics are always the first priority that you have to deal with. And Alexander Hamilton is going to create a series of steps, a series of reports that are submitted to Congress to try to get the government up and running economically. Hamilton and Washington and John Adams are going to become the leaders of the Federalist Party. These are not the same people that supported the Constitution, but this is like a political party that begins to develop. And initially, the framers of the Constitution didn't really think about political parties as being established or developing, but that's going to happen very quickly. Hamilton, Washington, Adams will be the leaders of the Federalist. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison will be a leader of a group that is going to become known as the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson is going to favor agriculture, farms, small towns, and France. The Federalists are going to be more for manufacturing, large cities, and will lean more towards England. So you have two very different viewpoints. And Hamilton's reports for Congress and the funding that he wants to get done kind of reinforces the difference between them. And in the notes that I've given you to go along with this, I've listed what his reports called for and asked for. To get his reports passed through Congress, he basically worked out a deal with Jefferson and Madison. Madison was kind of the mover and shaker in Congress, and so in order to get these passed, he needed their support. And so they did some jockeying around, and Madison agreed to do that in exchange for enough votes to have the new national capital built in the South. And of course, that will become Washington, D.C., named for George Washington. As the French Revolution continued, it starts in 1789, in part because France had gone into debt trying to help us during the American Revolution. Washington accepted Jefferson's argument that the United States should recognize the new French government, becoming the first country to do so, and receive its new ambassador, a man named Edmund Charles Genet. But whenever a new ambassador comes to a country, that ambassador is supposed to go to the head of state, present their credentials, their papers, be formally welcomed into the country. Genet starts trying to recruit a navy and an army for France and doesn't get to Washington at all. And Washington becomes more and more angry as he's hearing these reports, convinces Jefferson that this man has to be sent back. But before they could do that, they get word that the French government that had sent him had already fallen, and that if he were to be sent back, he would probably face the guillotine and be executed. Genet becomes one of the first people to actually go to the government and ask for political asylum, and Washington is going to give it to him. One of the things that Hamilton had pushed for in his reports was a tax on whiskey, and that caused really hard feelings along the frontier. And so you're going to have a thing known as the Whiskey Rebellion that is going to break out in 1794. It's going to be very short-lived. Hamilton hoped to go and lead troops, become like a hero in leading these troops, and Washington got caught up in it as well, and it kind of fades away. A very popular treaty negotiated during this time was between U.S. and Spain. This was Pinckney's treaty. One part of that was that he won acceptance of the right of free navigation of the Mississippi, the right to deposit goods at New Orleans for 3 years with the promise of renewal, and a promise on each side to refrain from inciting Indian attacks on the other. And as I mentioned, and I will continue to mention, the Mississippi River was a vital form of transportation in the country at that time. Roads were not really good at all, and so the Mississippi was the easiest, best way to transport goods. So to have the right of free navigation was very significant. To be able to take your goods under this right of deposit, it meant that Americans could take goods from their river rafts and boats, store them on shore in New Orleans before transferring them to ocean ships without having to pay any tax or tariffs to Spain. So this was a great deal. Everybody was thrilled by this treaty. Washington is going to serve 2 terms, and then he decides not to run in 1796. The Federalists chose John Adams as their presidential candidate, along with Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina. The Republicans drafted Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, and at that point, Hamilton decided to intervene. The Constitution then just said that each member of the Electoral College should cast 2 votes without indicating his choice of president or vice president. Whoever received the most votes was to be president, provided he had a majority, and the candidate who had the next highest number was vice president. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution in 1804 will change that. As I said, they had not really thought in terms of political parties. So you could end up having a president be a member of one party and a vice president be a member of another party. In any case, Hamilton did not like Adams, and he thought Thomas Pinckney could be influenced easier than Adams. So he tried to have some of the Federalists withhold a few votes from Adams to bring Pinckney in first. And he was really contacting the Federalists in South Carolina to get them to do that. They ended up dividing their vote between Pinckney and Jefferson, but New Englanders got wind of what was going on and dropped Pinckney completely. So the result was to cut Pinckney out of both offices and put Jefferson in as vice president. So now you have Adams, a Federalist, as president, Jefferson, Democratic Republican, as vice president. These 2 men had been very good friends and had worked well together. This time in office together is going to become very close to destroying their friendship, and they will come back together again toward the end of their life and kind of start their through a correspondence. But this almost brings an end to a very long-term friendship. And when we come back next time, I'll talk some more about that.